Hey there, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Things That Bug Me. It's a slightly different one than normal. I'm going to be here on my own. I'm actually going to be focusing kind of on another YouTube channel, though not exactly. But I'll explain what I mean in a minute, but I need to give a little bit of background first. So this centers around Terrence Howard's appearance on Joe Rogan a week or two ago, where he spent about 3 hours unpacking an entirely whole new, brand new theory of everything, based on completely different principles and ideas than our current understanding of how the universe works. Now, given that he's an actor and he's sort of done this in his spare time, it seems an outrageous and very bold claim. But I'm open to this kind of stuff, and so I listened with curiosity, and if I'm honest, there probably 70–80% of it I didn't really understand, or just straight away thought, no, that's silly, that's ridiculous. However, there were a few things that intrigued me, and so I went scouring YouTube for people that had looked at it and had comments to make on it, and I came across a couple of channels that purported to debunk it, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'd like to see what actually stands up to some serious scientific scrutiny. I mean, I have a basic grounding in chemistry and biology. I did undergraduate level that, but I'm not a highly educated person, right? I'm curious and I'm inquisitive, I'm reasonably intelligent, but there's a great deal I do not know. And so I went hunting for people that know more than I do, who had looked at it, were analysing it, critiquing it, and could maybe help me sort some of the wheat from the chaff. So we are now circling around to the thing that bugs me. One of the channels I came across was a channel by the name of Professor Dave Explains. And he's got 3.2 million subscribers, something like that. And his introductory video says that he is someone who is a serious inquirer into science and analysis and critiquer and debunker of silly ideas, and that he won't get you bogged down in extraneous detail. He'll just give you the science as it is, nice and clean and simple.
Welcome to Professor Dave Explains. I'm Dave, and this channel is for learning. There are a lot of YouTube channels for learning, but this one is different. I'm not going to dazzle you with science-flavored edutainment that's fun to watch, but falls short at delivering real knowledge. I'm also not going to just stand here and lecture at a blackboard for 2 hours at a time. I want to give you something in between. The shortest, easiest route there has ever been to a working understanding of everything around you, from the infinitesimally small to the incomprehensibly large.
So I started watching Professor Dave's critique, and within a few minutes it was very evident to me that all he was actually interested in doing here was ridiculing the man. And so the thing that bugs me is not specifically Professor Dave, although I'm going to use him as an exemplar of it, but what bugs me is the quality of science communication and public inquiry into ideas circulating in science. So I very rarely comment on videos, but I felt moved to on this one, and so I put a comment on Dave's video, which I will display for you here and read out to you. So I begin with, all you are doing here, Professor Dave, is erecting straw men and knocking them down. Whatever reasonable points you might make are lost in the resulting mass of straw. Your subscribers might enjoy it, but scientific analysis or critique this is not. He replied, which straw man, dipshit? Be specific. Timestamp, please. Make me laugh, fuckstick. So at this point I thought, well, this doesn't seem like a man who's interested in a conversation, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he's just playing a role for his channel, you know. And so I sent him a message saying, actually, I'm quite willing to get into this with you. Can I just ask you first, though, who am I dealing with here? Am I dealing with Dave the man or the Professor Dave persona? Giving him an opportunity to recognize this is actually a human being here, and we can maybe talk to each other a bit more civilly. So he responded to that by saying, quit stalling, fuckwad. Straw man, please. Timestamp. Grow the fuck up and say something. And so that's what this video is me responding to that. So I will say something in this video here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play back sections of Dave's rebuttal video and then go through what my issues are with his rebuttal video. Before I do that, though, just a word on the general tone of the thing. It's very much an ad hominem personal attack on Terrence Howard, right? The number of times he refers to him as a narcissist and delusional and crazy and egoic and so on. You know, he's never met him, he doesn't know him, by his own admission has never seen him as an actor, and so he knows literally nothing about him, and yet is prepared to pass judgment on him. So the whole tone of the thing, there's an arrogance and a certainty and a dismissiveness which I found quite repellent right from the very start. But nevertheless, I forced my way through the video, and I will give a step-by-step critique of the content of the video itself. And one other thing before I get into that, I'm going to try very hard to avoid any personal attacks on Dave and restrict my criticisms to his words and his behaviour, and make no assumptions or judgments about the man or the character of the man himself. I don't know, he may just be playing a role for his channel.
Hey everyone, I've been getting a lot of requests lately as to who to debunk next, and several dozen of you have asked me to address the complete insanity that was Terrence Howard's recent appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast. While I normally avoid lunatics of this caliber, I felt this one was worth addressing for a few reasons, so let's take a closer look. If you don't know who Terrence Howard is, he's an actor. I'll be honest, I've never seen him act in anything. He was in a really popular TV show that I didn't watch, and I've never seen any of his movies. He might be a great actor, he might suck. I don't know, and I don't care. What's more important is his extracurricular activities as a delusional narcissist who thinks he's the smartest person in human history. I don't know exactly when he started showing the world his God complex, but it was way before the Rogan appearance, so let's go back just a bit.
Alright, let's just pause it there for a minute. So it's 47 seconds in the video at this point, and so far Terrence Howard has been described as insane, as a lunatic, as a delusional narcissist, and as having a God complex. And Dave's also made it very clear that he hasn't seen him act in anything, doesn't know anything about him, and doesn't care about him in any way. So there's a few things here. Firstly, it's very, very dismissive. Secondly, it's very dehumanizing. And thirdly, it's just unkind, it's unnecessary, it's nasty, and for what reason? You're doing this in public. Terrence Howard is a human being. Agree with him or not, delusional or not, he's a human being deserving of kindness, courtesy, just like anybody else is. And piling on with a bunch of ad hominem attacks in the first 47 seconds feels very much at odds with the spirit of honest, open, humble inquiry and curiosity, which is at the very heart of science, or at least science as I understand it. And one final thing before we go on, it's really unfair, it's really biasing. Anybody watching this video has no possibility of taking anything Terrence Howard says from this point on seriously, because he's been framed as an insane, lunatic, delusional narcissist with a God complex that you don't care about. And so how can we possibly do anything from this point on but ridicule and mock anything that he has to say? So I'm going to come back to this again and again, but my fundamental gripe with this video is that it is not about inquiry, it is not about getting at the truth, it's about mocking, it's about elevating oneself by looking clever at somebody else's expense. And as I'm about to go on and show, all Dave has really actually done here, for the most part, he does make a couple of valid points, and I'll get to those as well, but for the most part, all he's actually doing is erecting straw men and knocking them down. And by that, what I mean is, he's not actually addressing what Terrence Howard is saying, he is addressing some stripped-down, cartoon, ridiculous version of what Terrence Howard is saying, which he can then mock and ridicule very easily in order to get a cheap laugh. That's very much what the whole video feels like to me, and I think this opening 47 seconds embodies that pretty well. But, well, we'll get on to some more substantive stuff very shortly. Let's move on.
Here he is making a total fool of himself on the red carpet at the Emmys in 2019.
I've made some discoveries in my own personal life with the science that, Pythagoras was searching for. I was able to open up the flower of life properly and find the real wave conjugations that we've been looking for 10,000 years. Why would I continue, walking on water for tips when I've got an entire generation to teach a whole new world?
That's a big remark.
Okay, let's break this down. The science that Pythagoras was searching for. Pythagoras was a philosopher and mathematician. The only things he did that could be considered part of the embryonic stages of science were ideas like the harmony of the spheres, where the planets moved according to the frequencies of musical notes, which of course was just baseless conjecture and whimsy, coincidentally Terry's two favorite things. He says he was able to open up the flower of life properly. That's this. The idea of opening this up doesn't mean anything. It's just 19 overlapping circles. If you pull them apart, you get 19 circles. Yes, it's nice and pretty looking. Shapes are neat.
Okay, we're going to pause again there. We're still less than 2 minutes in, and there's so much to unpack in this. So firstly, just a little bit more of what I said in the first section. You know, again, in the first few seconds of this last little bit, he's called him a fool, and that conjecture and whimsy are two of his favourite things. So again, it's just not necessary, and it doesn't help, and it's not scientific inquiry, right? It's just ad hominem attack and calling people names. Anyway, firstly, the point about Pythagoras and the flower of life. I mean, Pythagoras, not to mention Euclid and Plato, who are both relevant to this discussion, were all intimately familiar with the flower of life and contemplated it deeply. Indeed, Pythagoras' theory of right-angled triangles, Plato's notion of of ideal solids, all emerged out of their contemplations of the flower of life. So to write the flower of life off as nothing more than a neat shape of 19 overlapping circles, which it's not, by the way, it's not 19 overlapping circles, it's overlapping spheres and not 19, I can't remember because it's in 3 dimensions, I can't remember what the number is, but it doesn't really matter, it's overlapping spheres. And so, as you can see in this short video clip, the 5 platonic solids are embedded in the flower of life, as is the Merkaba, as is the Star of David, as is Metatron's cube. The flower of life is not just a neat shape, it's the foundation of all of our geometrical structures. And the way we get them is by joining up vertices where the circles cross over with each other. We join up those vertices and connect them with straight lines. And by doing that, we get these 5 platonic solids come out of it. But the creation of the straight lines is Terrence Howard's issue. He's saying there are no straight lines in nature, and therefore the platonic solids are not real things. They are ideal forms, they are approximations, they are abstractions, they do not represent actual reality. And so this was I have to say, the point at which I started to feel really let down by the channel, because I know this stuff about the flower of life, and I would have thought that someone commenting on work which is based entirely around the flower of life would have inquired into it a little bit, so that they weren't so ignorant of what it actually means, stands for, represents, contains. In the same way, the notion of straight lines and flat planes does not represent reality. It is an abstraction, an approximation. And so the joining together of vertices with straight lines is one way of decoding the flower of life. Terrence believes that he has found a deeper, more true way of decoding the flower of life. And what emerges from his decoding is what we see later on in the video, these tetrahedra with the curved edges and derivatives of those, right? Like addition derivatives of those. And according to his theory, these are the fundamental building blocks of reality, and it is arrangements of these at particular orientations that manifest as particles, photons, etc. Now, I get it's a little out there and it's a little wacky, but that doesn't make it wrong. And just because we don't understand a thing doesn't mean that it's wrong and that we get to mock it. It may be wrong, but I don't feel qualified to judge that. I found it interesting and worthy of further inquiry, which is why I came to these channels, in the hope that they might help me unpack it a little bit further.
That's a big remark, says the interviewer, clearly pretty desperate to get out of this ridiculous conversation without directly insulting him.
What do you intend to do?
Well, let me put it this way. All energy in the universe is expressed in motion. All motion is expressed in waves. All waves are curved. So where does the straight lines come from to make the platonic solids? There are no straight lines. So when I took the flower of life and opened it properly, I found a whole new wave conjugations that expose the in-between spaces. It's the thing that holds us all together.
Okay,
I didn't do too well in trigonometry. What is the
platonic solids?
How is energy expressed exactly? By motion? Whatever he could mean by that, he's wrong. For example, potential energy is the energy held by an object by virtue of its position in a field, like a gravitational or electromagnetic field. No motion, yet energy. Matter can be converted to energy. No motion required.
All right, I'm going to pause it again there. I'm not going to do the entire video. The early parts are particularly packed with stuff, but I'll pick out a few more. I think I'll make the point by doing that. But anyway, so in this particular bit, this energy is expressed as motion. He challenges that and gives a couple of examples of why that's not true. And I think both of these are not good examples. And so the first one of potential energy, the ball in the gravitational field. Higher up in the gravitational field has more potential energy, but how did it get higher up in that gravitational field? It had to be moved there, right? So motion is what gave it its potential energy. The motion to put it higher in the gravitational field is what gave it its potential energy, and it will express that potential energy when it eventually rolls down the hill and gets back into motion. And so all of that energy is actually expressed as motion. The potential energy is energy unexpressed, right? It's not actually energy expressing, it's energy unexpressed. It's potential energy. It's not actually energy expressing. It only expresses when it becomes kinetic energy, energy of motion. And similarly with the example of fission, in order for the two particles to come together to do fission, they have to arrive at incredibly high velocities in order to overcome electron repulsion. And so there's a huge amount of kinetic energy in motion of those particles when they come together and collide. And when the fission takes place, a smaller particle is ejected and or radiation is ejected. And so both of these things is photons and or particles being ejected from the collision site. So motion energy in, motion energy out, all energy being expressed as motion. And so to say that these things are not, that there's no motion in these examples is absurd. And another layer down from that, to say that ball being held up on the shelf or whatever, high in the gravitational field, to suggest that ball is motionless is again absurd. You know, it's on the Earth, which is rotating and moving around the sun, which is in turn moving around the center of the galaxy, and so on and so on and so on. That ball, whatever it is made up of trillions and trillions and trillions of particles, each of which is vibrating. And so the idea that anything is motionless, that there is anything ever is motionless, is absurd on its face. And so to critique the idea that energy is expressed as motion and to use those examples, which is clearly energy being expressed as motion in all of those cases, is just ridiculous. All right, so let's move on.
Linear motion also exists, hence straight lines exist. And just for fun, if you take a simple cubic lattice structure for an ionic solid, you can get those straight lines he said don't exist. Again, he did not open any flower of life, he did not conjugate any waves, he doesn't specify what these spaces are and what they are between, or how they hold anything together.
Okay, so I want to challenge the straight lines thing here. He gives two examples of straight lines. A rocket traveling through space, that is linear motion, and that if you look at a cubic lattice structure, that you've got straight lines there. And again, very poor examples in my opinion. So let's deal with the rocket traveling through space first of all. As Einstein revealed to us, space-time is not flat, space-time is curved because space-time contains mass. And there's a very beautiful saying emerges out of relativity that mass tells space-time how to curve and space-time tells mass how to move. And so mass is moving through space-time, which is curved, and mass is causing space-time to curve as it moves through it. And so it actually speaks to the deep interconnectedness of matter and space-time, right? That they dance with each other in this beautiful way. Anyway, that's somewhat secondary, but the point is, all space-time is curved, and therefore anything moving through it is not moving through it in a straight line. It is moving on a curved trajectory. It may appear straight, but it is on the space-time through which it is traveling is itself curved, and therefore straight lines do not exist. They are useful abstractions, but they are not real. Similarly, in the cubic lattice structure, those straight lines only exist because you've drawn straight lines between the particles there. But in the actual lattice, those particles are in a constant state of motion and vibration, right? They're not in the same spot that you can draw nice, neat straight lines between them. Whatever lines you could draw between them would be constantly fluctuating like that. What have we got here? We've got a wave. And so, you know, this idea that static straight lines exist in nature is, on its face, absurd. And to try and critique him for saying that is equally absurd. It undermines the entire critique, right? When you're so not addressing the actualities of what the man is saying. Anyway, let's move on to the next bit.
I'm sharing that on Tuesday when I receive my star. I'm going to be able to prove that gravity is only an effect and not a force. I'm putting something on YouTube where I will build the planet Saturn without gravity and build the Milky Way galaxy without gravity.
Did you also say you're getting your star on Tuesday?
Yeah.
On the Walk of Fame?
On the Walk of Fame.
Interestingly enough, in the context of general relativity, you can argue that gravity is an effect and not a force. But it does not follow, then, that gravity isn't real. And it gets much worse from there. He's going to build Saturn and build the Milky Way galaxy. How exactly? Like in a simulation? That needs gravity. If he built a planet or a galaxy with his hands, I would worship him as the one true God.
Alright, so here he's referencing the God complex again, right? I can build planets, I can build galaxies. I've watched these simulations and they're actually extremely impressive. Now, is it possible that they are hoaxes, that they are just animations, that, you know, it's not actually... Yeah, it's possible. I'm not qualified to judge that. But according to the video that I watched and the explanation that is given during the course of the video, this is a simulation with, I can't remember how many thousands of, you know, little particulate bits, and then forces are applied to them. So you have a bunch of vortices in the center, you have electric and magnetic forces at the poles and the equators, and that's it. And from the application of those parameters, the arrangement of the planet of Saturn emerges beautifully. I mean, exactly as observed, with the same bands, the same ring structure, even the hexagon at the pole. And similarly with the Milky Way, again, the same notion of vortices at the center driving the process, and pressure and relaxation applied at the poles and the equator. I don't fully understand all of this, which is again why I went to these channels, in order that they might help me to understand it better. But the simulations that he runs tally perfectly with observations from telescopes and so on, and do not require the use of the force of gravity, do not require the presence of dark matter, do not require the presence of dark energy. And so, to me, as a layperson, assuming that it's not just a fraud, I mean, if it is just a fraud, then it's a fraud and I've been taken in and whatever, but assuming it is actually a simulation using a totally different set of parameters than the ones we would be used to, right, gravity and so on, then it's very, very, very impressive that the simulations and observations match so very perfectly with each other. I don't think this is something to be dismissed. If you think it's a fraud and he's hoaxing us, then fair enough. You could be right. As I say, I can't say for sure. But if it is an actual simulation, and the chap running it was from, I don't actually recall the university now, but the chap running it was from a very reputable university. And so, you know, if they're hoaxers, they're hoaxers. But I personally found those simulations to be very, very impressive.
So if you can prove that an action times an action equals a reaction, which science proves, then 1 times 1 must equal more than 1. And to have the physical proof of it, that kind of shakes things up a bit.
Well, you're a shaker-upper.
Wow, if you can prove that an action times an action equals a reaction. Okay, numbers are not actions. They're numbers, so that doesn't mean anything. An action times an action also doesn't mean anything, because actions are not numbers. Also, no, 2 actions do not necessarily cause a reaction, no matter what he could possibly mean by reaction. If 2 forces are acting on an object that are equal in magnitude but opposite in direction, the object won't move. 2 actions, no reaction. Sorry, Terry. But more importantly than demonstrating how everything he just said is bananas idiotic, let's review what multiplication is. Multiplication is an elementary arithmetic operation which is essentially repeated addition. 1 times 4 literally means the number 1 4 times, and then you add them up. 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4. 1 times 3. Write 1 3 times. Add them up. You get 3. 1 times 2. 1 twice. 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 times 1 means you write 1 1 time. So it's 1. There's nothing to add. His revolutionary discovery is just him being dumber than a toddler. And toddlers do like to shake things, so this lady isn't wrong.
Well, you're a shaker-upper.
Okay, so once again, there's a fair bit to unpack here. So this 1 times 1 equals 2 thing, I will admit I'm also very baffled by this 1 times 1 equals 2 thing. That said, I wouldn't dismiss it as the rantings of a moronic infant, or whatever it was he called him in that thing. Because there is something about it, right? So there's a couple of things which occur to me. There is something to what he's saying, and rather than just completely dismiss it, I'm sort of open to the idea that maybe I'm missing something really profound and fundamental that my programming will not allow me to see. So a couple of things that occur to me with this 1 times 1 equals 2 thing. Firstly, 1 times 1 equals 2, you have 2 1s on the left hand side of the equation, 1 1 on the right hand side of the equation. So material has been lost somehow or other. You've done a multiplication and material has been lost. Just at a very, very basic level. Right? I'm not talking about performing mathematical functions. I'm just saying at the most basic level, you've got 2 1s on the left-hand side, 1 1 on the right-hand side. You've done a multiplication, and yet you've lost material. Let's not forget, multiplication by definition means to increase in number. And so multiplication that doesn't increase in number, first of all, is odd. And secondly, to perform an operation on something and leave it unchanged. This is also very odd. You know, in the real world, you don't do something to something and leave it unchanged. If it's unchanged, then you haven't done anything to it, right? So to perform an operation and leave the thing unchanged seems weird. And this leads into the identity problem that he talks about. So 1 and 0 are special numbers in mathematics. They are assigned identity properties. And so by definition, any number multiplied by 1 is itself. Any number multiplied by 0 is 0. And he has an issue with this as well. And I can kind of see why. Like I've just said, performing an operation on something and leaving it unchanged means that you haven't actually performed an operation on something. And so multiplying by something by 1 and having it remain unchanged, it's like a null operation, right? You've written something down which you haven't actually done. You haven't performed an operation even though you've written one down. So this 1 times 1 equals 2, I kind of feel like 1 times 1 is something different to 1. 1 squared. And I know 1 squared is 1 times 1, which is 1. I get that. But still, like, you've actually done something to the 1. You have altered it, increased it in some way, and so you've added another dimension to this 1. Just while we're on the identity thing, there's multiplying by 0 equals 0. I mean, I know we're all used to this. We all learned this at school. It all makes sense to us, right? Because we're so accustomed to it. But again, to perform a multiplication on something and end up with nothing at all, right? You had something, you multiply by 0, and now you have nothing at all. Again, just mapping that onto reality. You can't do that. It's like something doesn't come along, encounter something else, and you end up with nothing, right? Like the conservation of energy, conservation of momentum, etc. He also makes another point in his book about waveforms, that to say 1 times 1 is to create 2 waveforms, and yet you are left with just 1 waveform. Again, this is a fundamental imbalance. So I sort of get what he's driving at. I mean, I don't fully understand it, and I'll never be able to say 1 times 1 equals 2 by that logic. 2 times 1 equals 3. 3 times 2 equals 6. Sorry, 3 times 2 equals 9, but 2 times 3 equals 6. It equals 8. Sorry, 2 times 3 equals 8, but 3 times 2 equals 9. It doesn't, you know, there's a lot about it that doesn't make any sense to me, and yet I feel like there's something underneath it. The other thing is this action times action equals reaction. I agree with Dave here. Action times action doesn't make any sense. Like, just semantically, linguistically, it doesn't make any sense. He does this thing in his book as well, where he talks about money times money. 10 cents times 10 cents is 100 cents, which is $1. But 10 cents times 10 cents, if you treat it as a tenth of a dollar times a tenth of a dollar, is a hundredth of a dollar. And so, you know, 1 cent versus 100 cents. And I sort of get the point that he's making, but you can't multiply money by money. It doesn't make any sense to do that. And so it is very garbled, it is very confused, and yet I feel like there's something underneath it all. So I have to say I sort of agree with Dave here, but his point about equal and opposite forces create no reaction, well, that's not true. No movement of the box in his little diagram, no movement in the box, but there is compression of the box. There is not no reaction. There may be no obvious visible reaction, but there is not no reaction. That is not true. Actions always create reactions. Whether there's 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 of them, whether they're balanced with each other or not, some kind of reaction always occurs. Otherwise, energy would simply be disappearing from the universe, and we all agree that that can't happen. So in short, although I too am a little bit bamboozled by the 1 times 1 equals 2, I do sort of kind of get what he's driving at. And I'm willing to accept the possibility that maybe there's something I don't get. Maybe there's something I just cannot see. And I can live with that possibility. I don't have to dismiss him and call him an idiot just because I can't immediately see his point. I think there's another point worth making here as well, is that Terrence Howard is not offering some new idea about something or other, right? He's offering an entire ground up revision of the way that we think about the universe itself, right? A complete paradigm-altering way of thinking. So it's obviously going to not immediately feel comfortable and right. It's going to upend everything that we currently... If he's right, and I get that it's a massive if, but if he's right, it is going to upend almost absolutely everything that we think we know about the world, right? We're going to have to revise almost everything that we think we know and understand about the world. And so, of course, for people well versed in existing ideas about how the world works and think it all makes sense, they're going to feel a lot of resistance to it. I really do not like Terrence's use of 1 × 1 = 2 as an entry point into this. This is what he uses at the start of his book to try and get people to start thinking differently. And I think it's a bad ploy, because I just don't think most people will get past the initial resistance to the, nah, that's bollocks. And they'll just move on and they won't look any deeper into it. But I would like to offer a different entry point into it, which I think is much more accessible, namely Newton's first law of motion. And so Newton's first law of motion states that a body will remain at rest or travel in a straight line at a constant speed unless acted upon by an external force. Now, from bits earlier on in this video, I think it's been pretty clear there is no such thing as at rest. All things are in motion. There is no such thing as at rest, and there is no such thing as straight lines in space-time that has mass in it, right? There is no such thing as straight lines. And so what does Newton's first law actually mean? A body remains at rest or travels in a straight line at constant speed. Well, there are no straight lines, there is no at rest, and so what does Newton's first law actually mean? So, you know, if your goal is to be an engineer and build machines, then Newton's laws of motion are perfectly good enough. Relativity is a higher resolution calculation for things like that, but in most on-Earth context, the 11th decimal place or whatever it is really doesn't matter. And so Newton's laws of motion, although they are not true, they are not actual reflections of the real world, they're good enough, right? They are good enough. They work really well. They're simple to use. They're good enough. When you start talking about large distances, you need to use relativity. When you start talking about deep inquiries into the nature of reality itself, approximations and, you know, false suppositions are not good enough anymore. Those things have to be got underneath, and that's what he's proposing here. And the belligerent resistance to it seems to me to be rooted in fear. Like, what are you actually afraid of? To open your mind up and consider it. Don't have to accept it, don't have to agree with it, but to actually consider it. Let it in a little bit and see what it feels like, rather than just put up a wall and bounce it off you, because it is, before you've even looked at it, it's obviously ridiculous.
Walter Russell, who was not a chemist, made this in the 1920s, and it doesn't mean anything. The chemical elements display periodicity. You can illustrate that periodicity in rows, or you can make spirals and other shapes. It's arbitrary, and listing elements this way doesn't offer any novel insight into chemistry or any predictive power whatsoever. Terry just likes the shape as much as he likes pretending to understand chemistry better than chemists, or 10th graders for that matter.
And when you say rebuild the periodic table, what do you mean specifically?
Well, the way the periodic table is laid out, you'll see hydrogen sitting all the way over there by itself, but they don't show that hydrogen has the same tone as carbon.
What do you mean by tone?
Same tone, same key of E. Same key of E. 40.5 hertz. The next one would be like 81 hertz. You go to silicon, it will double up and would be 162 hertz. You'll go to cobalt, and it'll be 324 hertz. It's, you know, in that base, if you were to take the angles of incidence or the tones that they create, you know, their color, like you can turn color back into sound.
Joe wants to know what the hell he's talking about, and Terry is off to the races rambling about tones. Elements are not tones. They're not notes. They're not keys. They're not anything related to music whatsoever. They're atoms with a particular number of protons in the nucleus. He's throwing out random terminology and random numbers. Angle of incidence has to do with light. Sounds are not colors, and there's nothing more to say about this unparalleled gibberish.
Yeah, so this is another one that I don't really get, if I'm honest, but I do find some appeal in it. So, I mean, first of all, he describes Walter Russell's diagram of the elements as doesn't mean anything, right? Like it adds nothing, and that's simply not true. It's a completely different way of looking at the table of chemical elements as an expanding waveform, right? So it's not elements morph into each other. And I get that this sounds completely crazy. You know, I was trained just as Professor Dave. I was trained in the notion of what defines an atom is the number of protons in its nucleus. You add a proton, you go up one in the periodic table. Periodicity is found, you know, in groups of 8. It is interesting that there are 8 notes in an octave and that the periodicity in the periodic table is also 8. And he's talking about musical tones, and that those harmonic frequencies correspond to musical notes. And so things with the same musical note are in the same period of the periodic table at different octaves. I mean, aesthetically, it's a very beautiful, logical kind of thing. Not to say it's right, of course. And so under this theory, right or wrong, the chemical elements are no longer defined by the number of protons in their nucleus. They are defined by the harmonics of the resonance frequencies that are holding them together. So the condensation or crystallization of the ether according to electric and magnetic pressures at particular harmonic frequencies, this is what defines an element. And again, it's totally different. I mean, this is the whole point. It is totally different. And so the idea that this periodic table doesn't say anything new is completely ridiculous. It may be wrong, but it is certainly saying something new and different. It's worth mentioning also that Nikola Tesla was aware of Walter Russell's work, and in a letter to Russell said to him, you should lock this away for 1,000 years. The world is not yet ready for it. It can come out of the vault in 1,000 years when people will actually understand it. So again, it speaks to this idea of truly paradigm-changing stuff is not accepted by the world when it first enters it.
Wow. I wish I could really truly understand exactly what you're saying, because I'm kind of getting it and you're doing a great job explaining it. But if you're right, that really changes everything.
Everything.
And it accounts for why physics kind of hits a stalling point.
It doesn't matter that Joe has no clue what he's saying. Instead of entertaining the idea that he isn't really saying anything, he just blindly asserts that the Emperor has all his clothes on, and that the imaginary garments must be so much better than the drab and outdated clothing that establishment science provides. A field which obviously must be stalling just because he refuses to lift a finger to learn how vibrant the field really is.
Yeah, this is something that really gets on my tits with people who think of themselves as scientists, as this smug, arrogant, we've got it all figured out, and anything that comes along that challenges it must by definition be nonsense because this is definitely right and we are certain of it. This is not science. This is scientism. This is dogma. This is the protection of dogma and the burning at the stake of anybody who attempts to challenge that dogma. That's all it is that this is religious fervor. This is not scientific inquiry. Yeah, in here he has a go at Joe Rogan for being a moron and for saying that physics is stuck when it is in fact thriving. So I'd like to push back on this and offer a couple of examples where physics is far from thriving. And so firstly, string theory. For 20, 30 years, something like that, many of the smartest minds in the world have been devoting themselves to string theory, which by its own admission will never produce any testable predictions. And so it can never ever be any more than some kind of theoretical construct that can never be mapped onto the actualities of the real world because it makes no testable predictions. And so say what you want about Terrence Howard's work. It may be right, it may be nonsense, but at least it does make some testable predictions. He's going to build things and try things out and run simulations based on these ideas, which will test them. And so, you know, they will stand or they will fail, but they are testable. So it's actually way better science than the nonsense of string theory. The other counter example I would offer is cosmology, where you know, the cosmological model, as observational data has poured in through ever increasingly good telescopes, for example, the model doesn't hold up. And so the model has had to invent dark matter and dark energy, this invisible stuff, which is whatever, 90% of the universe is this invisible stuff that we don't know what it is and we can't measure it and so on. And so, you know, rather than question the model itself, we've added a whole bunch of stuff which is, again, unproven, supposed, unfindable, whatever. So, you know, the notion that physics is thriving and that it is resting on solid foundations, maybe, but there's a lot of unanswered questions, and he says that his theory will answer these questions. And so, like I said, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it is the answer to everything, but to pretend that physics is currently resting on solid foundations is nonsensical. I mean, as I mentioned earlier on with the first law of motion, right? That is one of the founding suppositions, and it's demonstrably not true. Anyway, so I would like to offer a metaphor at this point as well, that, you know, rotting foundations, if your foundations are in a building are crumbling and you built, you know, 100 stories of apartments on there for very rich people, well, at some point everyone has to get out of there and you have to redo the foundations. You know, you've got to rebuild the foundations, otherwise sooner or later the building's going to fall down. But what we're doing right now is we're putting more and more and more stories on this building in full knowledge that the foundations are not solid, and so sooner or later this building is going to fall down. So I get that this theory is way out there, way wacky, requires us to let go of pretty much everything we think we know about the universe, and, you know, there should be proper resistance. You can't just change your ideas for every single fad that comes along. I totally get that, and most of these things will be wrong, but on the very small chance that it might be right, and the payoff that would be involved in finding out that it was right, you know, the new vistas of potential progress that it would open up, I think it's worth at least proving it wrong, right, rather than just dismissing it out of hand.
They fuck with your phone?
Oh, I'm sure of it, because now I have to turn it off.
Look at the level of paranoia beyond the simple delusions. The shadow government is watching Terry because he debunked the Platonic solids, which are the basis of every economics course in every Rockefeller Jesuit institution. I'm shocked that he's not a flat earther, because this is exactly how they talk. But don't worry, he's an anti-vaxxer, obviously, and Joe is too.
You took a bold stand, though, years ago when the governments were trying to poison their citizens. You took a very bold stand that nobody else took. That's what I was like, wow, I appreciate you, because I lost 3-4 jobs because I refused to take it. I refused to
I bet you feel better about it now.
Well,
especially when you know all these people that have health problems because of it.
Cancers has increased 300%.
Yeah. All-cause mortality up 40% in some age groups.
Pulmonary embolisms almost up like 500%.
Yeah, wonder what caused that.
No, none of those things are true. You heard them on the internet and believed them.
So, yeah, a couple of things here. Firstly, like, what the fuck does this have to do with anything that he's saying? You know, like, what on earth do his views of vaccines have to do with his... I assume that you are showing this to undermine his credibility, that he's an anti-vaxxer, therefore he's a nutcase, and it's just one more string in the bow of he's a nutcase, and we should dismiss him. Second thing, like the paranoia, if you honestly think that people who are causing a stir are not being kept an eye on, then you're deluded. And equally, if you have not understood yet that there are very large increases in sudden unexplained cancers, cardiac events, all-cause mortality in younger age groups, particularly in the 18 to 49 age groups, and this is not internet rumors, this is government data. If you are honestly unaware of this, then it is willful ignorance on your part at this point. And once again, you should be ashamed of yourself. You've clearly not inquired into anything more deeply than when you should be going to get your next booster.
So is he saying that just by doing these calculations, it created the exact form of Saturn, including the rings?
Just the exact form of it.
Just with the calculations.
So you change the angles of incidence that these linchpins, because remember, each one of these these are opposing vortices. So there's 12 vortices to this that are opposing. So once the angles of incidence change, you change the motion and pressure conditions, you can now change the condition or the crystallization.
So he's pretending to explain planetary formation without gravity, and without explaining literally anything about what he's doing. Click a button, the planet is there. What are the dots? Where did the matter come from? How did it arrange itself? Planetary formation is a process. This just materialized out of thin air. How? There are no vortices, nothing is opposing, there is no angle of incidence, there is no crystallization. He is just listing random buzzwords.
Now, because we have the angles of incidence, material engineering can now separate the space between carbon and nitrogen or carbon and boron and have the same elements of titanium, vanadium, chromium, magnesium, and iron, or nickel, cobalt, nickel, copper, zinc, gallium, or germanium in those higher octaves. We can do that between silicon and phosphorus or silicon and aluminum. So the transparent aluminum now becomes possible because we can now control the pressure and change the pressure and motion conditions where we couldn't do that before because they were going by Cartesian space at 90 degrees and 45 degrees straight lines, the Euclidean space that they've made up, this orthogonal or church-like space that they've generated because they wanted to promote that cross.
He doesn't even know the names of the elements. He's saying mangasane instead of manganese. He says silicone instead of silicon because he doesn't know that silicone is a different material. He can't pronounce orthogonal. He's never even heard these words spoken before, and he is doing nothing whatsoever to actually explain anything about what he just showed to Joe.
Okay, I think this will be the last one. I think I've made my point. So a couple of things. Firstly, the Saturn simulation. I went into this earlier on. And Dave is quite right, like in this situation, he does not explain at all well how that simulation has run. It just, just push a button and boom, it comes. Fair comment in terms of his presentation on Joe Rogan, but not fair comment on you because the video on YouTube does explain all of that in some detail, both in the description and the audio of the video as the simulation is going. The guy that's running the simulation is explaining how it's all working while he's doing it. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this video. And as for making fun of him for getting the names wrong, yeah, all right, fair enough. I mean, it's in the stand-up comedy world, the knob gag or the dick joke is thought to be like the cheap shot, like the lowest form of getting a laugh, and that's kind of what this is, in my opinion, as well. But yeah, fair enough. It doesn't make him sound very smart, and I would say that he is generally a poor communicator of his ideas. I don't think he does a good job of making himself clear at all. I would agree that much of what he says comes out sounding garbled, confused, even nonsensical. If you were to read his book, it makes some more sense. I am still confused by some of it, even having read the book. But he does explore some very profound ideas. The nature of one, for example. What is one? You say one apple or one orange or one cow or whatever, but, for any one thing you show me, I can tell you that thing is made up of myriad other things. And so even the notion of one, when applied in the world, is a somewhat arbitrary thing. We draw a boundary around a collection of some things and we call that one other thing. Around a collection of atoms, and we call that thing an orange or whatever. So, the very notion of one is not simple. It's not obvious and clear what we actually mean by one. So, yeah, there's nuance and depth here, and you completely failed to explore that nuance and that depth. You have decided, without actually giving it any kind of reasonable chance at all, that it's nonsense on its face. You've watched it with the intention of finding things in it that you could ridicule and mock. You've not done any research. You've not done any due consideration. And with 3.5 million subscribers or whatever it is, me personally, if I had 3 million subscribers, I would feel a pretty heavy responsibility to be as truthful, to be as generous, to be as kind as I could do. But I've watched your videos, I've watched your replies to your comments, and you are nasty and rude and obnoxious, seemingly for fun. Now, as I say, I don't know you at all, Dave. I don't know you, the person, at all. You might be a super nice guy and you just put on this persona because you find that it generates more views, more activity, more traffic for your channel. And fair enough. I personally find that a little bit cynical, but fair enough. But I would entreat you, if that is your thing, is to troll people, wind them up in order to generate interest, then don't sell yourself as someone who is doing serious inquiry into serious science, because that's not what you're doing. You're doing hit pieces, you're doing, what are they called? Roasts. You're doing this kind of thing. It's mean, it's nasty, it's not constructive, it doesn't further understanding, it doesn't get us any closer to truth, and it serves no purpose other than, like I said, to be mean. Maybe it's funny to some people. That's the only possible useful function I can see this serving. So I will close off with that. I will also invite you / challenge you to put this video up on your channel, a rebuttal of your rebuttal, and see if you have the balls to actually do that. All right, I'm closing off now. Good day.